My parents decided my 16-year-old son was worth exactly $92,000. They didn't ask him, and they didn't ask me. They just waited for their 50th anniversary to tell him he had to give it all away. My name is Renee, and this is the year I found out my parents had been quietly pricing my son's future before they ever told him it was for sale. I didn't know it then, but the very things I was proud of him for building were exactly what my parents were using to measure his fair share. Mason builds keyboards, not the kind you buy off a shelf at an office supply store on East State Street, the kind people pay $400 for online because the switches feel right under their fingers and the sound, when you type, lands somewhere between a typewriter and rain. He started at 13 with a soldering iron I bought him for Christmas because he'd watched 11 hours of teardown videos and asked very seriously whether I thought he could build one himself. I said I didn't see why not. I had no idea what that sentence would cost or earn either one of us. His workshop is the unfinished half of our basement on the west side of Rockford, a few blocks off Kishwaukee, in the kind of house where the furnace clanks every November, like it's clearing its throat for winter. He keeps his first build in a hardshell case under his bed, not on display, not framed, just kept. A slightly crooked board he calls Atlas Zero, named after the brand he eventually built around it. One of the stabilizers sits a hair off center. He has known how to fix that since he was 14. He has never fixed it. If I fix it, he told me once, not looking up from a soldering station that smelled like hot rosin and patience, then it's not the first one anymore. It's just a better version of the first one. He talks like that, precise, a little sideways. He'll go quiet for an hour and then say something that rearranges the whole room. On Sunday mornings, before either of us is fully awake, I'll find him at the kitchen table with a tray of switches sorted by spring weight, testing each one between his thumb and forefinger like he's checking a pulse. He doesn't perform his focus for anyone. He just has it, the way some kids have a jump shot or a singing voice, except his version of it lives in his hands and in a spreadsheet he updates every night before bed, tracking parts costs against what people are willing to pay for something built slow and built right. I am telling you all of this first because I need you to understand who Mason was before any of this started, because everything that follows tried in its very calm and very reasonable way to make all of us forget it. My parents, Walt and Carol Voss, have run Voss Tool and Die out of a building on Kilburn Avenue since before I was born, the third generation to do it, supplying precision components to bigger manufacturers across northern Illinois, the kind of customers who need a tolerance measured in thousands and don't care whose hands made it as long as it's right. My father still walks the floor every morning at 6, even now, even at 71, because that's the only way he trusts a shop to actually be running. My mother runs the books, runs the family, runs most rooms she's ever stood in, and does it with a warmth that has fooled smarter people than me for longer than I'd like to admit. I told myself, for years, that my parents simply measured love the way they measured everything else. In output, in hours logged, in whether you showed up. I told myself my brother Gary's son Derek would eventually find his footing at the shop, the way slow starters sometimes do, and that my parents' patience with him was just generosity toward a kid who needed more runway than most. I told myself that when my mother praised the shop's newest apprentice for real work, work you can put your hands on, and then changed the subject the second I mentioned Mason's keyboards. She simply didn't understand what he did. Not that she'd already decided it didn't count. There is a woman named Phyllis Crenshaw who has done the books at Voss Tool and Die for almost 20 years, ever since my mother's eyesight started giving her trouble with the smaller print. Phyllis also, as a kindness, started helping Mason with his own bookkeeping 2 years ago, when his keyboard business outgrew a shoebox of receipts, taught him how to track quarterly estimated taxes, helped him file the paperwork for his LLC, never charged him a dime, brought him a sleeve of thank you cookies the day his first 1099 came through like it was a graduation. I am telling you about Phyllis now because you should remember her kindness, the actual real kindness of it, before you learn what she eventually did with what that kindness gave her access to. The first thing happened in 8th grade, and at the time, I genuinely thought nothing of it. Mason had built a working robotic arm for the regional science fair, soldered and coded entirely himself, and the fair fell on the same Saturday as one of Derek's hockey tournaments. My parents went to the rink. I told myself that was simply a scheduling reality. Robots don't care what day you show up. Hockey does. Mason placed second in the district. He told my parents about it at dinner the following week. My mother said, "That's wonderful, honey. while reaching for the gravy, and then spent 4 minutes describing Derek's hat trick in detail neither parent had actually witnessed in person. The second thing happened 2 years later, and it should have told me everything, except I was still in the business of finding reasons not to see it. Mason entered a regional mechatronics competition that drew teams from 3 states and won $2,000 in prize money for a keyboard controller he'd designed from scratch. At the Sunday dinner where he mentioned it, my father asked one follow-up question. "They paid you for that?" And then my mother stood up with her wine glass to toast Derek, who had just gotten his driver's license that week, going on for a full minute about how proud they were of him for really stepping up. Mason sat very still through the toast. He didn't say anything. He just turned his water glass a quarter turn on the tablecloth, the way he does when he's recalculating something he doesn't want to say out loud. The third thing is the one that finally rearranged the furniture in my head, because by then it wasn't 2 isolated moments anymore. It was a pattern with a logic I could finally name. The year Mason turned 15, Atlas Keyboards crossed $50,000 in gross revenue, real revenue, filed with the IRS, the kind of number that would make any small business owner proud. I told my parents at a barbecue, hoping even then for something. My mother laughed. Not unkindly, she would say later, just lightly, and said, "That's not really money you earned, sweetheart. That's just luck. Real work is what happens on a shop floor." 3 weeks later, they pushed for Derek's promotion to floor foreman, despite 2 written warnings for tardiness that year, because my father said, "He's family, and family steps up when you give them the chance." That was the year I understood, watching my mother's face as she said the word luck, that there was a ledger running in that house that none of us outside the shop had ever been shown the terms of. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in October, while I was folding laundry and Mason was at school. My mother's voice on the phone had the particular brightness she uses for decisions she's already finished making and is simply informing you about. "We've been thinking," she said, "about what's fair for Derek, given everything. We think Mason should help him out. $92,000 feels right." She said the number the way you'd read a number off a price tag. Flat, certain, already settled somewhere upstream of this conversation. "Mom," I said, "where did that number even come from?" "Phyllis helped us think it through," she said, like that answered something instead of opening an entirely new wound. "We wanted to be reasonable." I did not say much else on that call. I have gone back over it so many times since that I could recite it the way you recite a verse you didn't choose to memorize, but can't forget. What I remember most clearly is hanging up the phone and standing in my own kitchen, laundry basket still on my hip, feeling something shift loose in my chest that I would spend the next month trying to name correctly. I told Mason that evening, after dinner, sitting across from him at the same table, where he sorts his switches. I told him plainly because he is 16 and he deserved the plain version of it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he reached over to where his backpack sat against the chair leg, pulled out the hardshell case he sometimes carries to school just to have nearby, and set both hands flat on top of it without opening it. "Is that why Grandpa never asks how the keyboards work?" he said. It took me a moment to understand the actual shape of that question. Not whether the money was fair, not whether he had to give it, but whether the years of polite disinterest had always been building toward exactly this. I didn't have an answer for him that night. I'm not sure I have one even now. What I didn't know yet, sitting there with my hand on my son's shoulder while he kept his hands flat on a case he wasn't going to open in front of me, was that my parents hadn't simply decided on a number out of thin air. They had spent 3 weeks gathering it, piece by piece, from someone Mason trusted completely, and they had done it before they ever once thought to ask him a single direct question about his own life. I spent the next several weeks the way you spend weeks when you're building a case against people you love, without quite admitting that's what you're doing. I called Phyllis carefully, the way you approach a friend you're afraid you're about to lose. She didn't deny it right away. She went quiet first, the particular quiet of someone deciding how much of the truth they can survive saying out loud. "Your mother asked me directly," she said finally. She said she needed to know what Mason actually had saved, not what he might say he had saved. I told her I didn't think that was right to share. She reminded me I've done the shop's books for 20 years for free, and that family helps family. Her voice cracked slightly on the word family, like she'd heard it used as a tool too many times to say it cleanly anymore. I gave her the number, Renee. I'm not proud of it. I told myself it was just information. It wasn't just information. $92,000. The exact figure in Mason's business savings account, down to the number Phyllis had access to because she'd helped him build it. Correctly, honestly, kindly, for 2 years. They hadn't picked a generous round number out of fairness. They had priced my son to the dollar. That was the moment I stopped being just a daughter who was hurt. I became a mother who was building a case. I sat with that alone on a Thursday night after Mason had gone to bed, and I started doing arithmetic of my own. The kind I'd never once itemized because itemizing felt unkind to people I loved. 11 years ago, when the shop needed a new CNC mill to stay competitive, I lent my parents $30,000 from the small inheritance my husband's father had left us. I have never once asked for it back. 6 winters running, when the shop's gas bill spiked every January and my mother called sounding tired in a way she never let herself sound in front of customers. I sent $150 a month without telling Mason or my husband, because that felt like the kind of thing you simply did and didn't discuss. $10,800 over 6 years. $40,800 total, given freely, never tracked, never mentioned at a single family dinner. They had never once, in 11 years, brought up the $30,000. They had needed 3 weeks to settle on $92,000 from my son. I want to tell you, I confronted my mother the moment I understood that math. I didn't. I told myself one more time that there was still a version of this where she would hear the number out loud and recognize it for what it was. The cost of that last piece of patience was watching my son, 2 days before his grandparents' anniversary party, sitting at his desk with a bank transfer form half filled out next to his laptop, researching, very quietly, how fast a wire transfer could move and whether closing his savings account would trigger any tax penalty he should plan for. He wasn't doing it because he believed it was right. I understood that the second I saw his face. The particular stillness of a kid trying to solve a problem, the only way he'd ever seen problems solved in that family, which was to absorb the cost quietly so nobody had to feel the friction of him refusing. "You don't have to do this," I said. "I don't want it to be a thing," he said, still looking at the screen. "I don't want to be the reason it's a thing at the party." That sentence is the moment everything in me that had been carefully, patiently waiting simply stopped waiting. Not because of the $30,000 no one ever repaid, not because of the heating bills or the science fair, or even Phyllis's quiet confession, because my son at 16 had already learned the exact lesson that family had been teaching for 3 generations, that the easiest way to keep the peace is to make yourself smaller before anyone asks you to. I did not tell him what I was about to do. I told him only that he wasn't filling out anything before the party, and that whatever happened there, it wasn't going to be his job to manage everyone else's comfort about it. I spent the 2 days before the anniversary party gathering what I needed, quietly. The way you gather things when you finally stopped hoping the other version of this conversation is still available. I asked Phyllis gently whether she'd be willing to put in writing, dated, what my mother had asked her, and when. She said yes before I finished the question, the particular fast yes of someone who has been waiting for permission to stop carrying something alone. I pulled the old loan paperwork for the CNC mill. 11 years yellowed at the corners, my father's signature still legible at the bottom. I printed the bank statement showing 6 years of heating subsidies, highlighted, dated, totaled at the bottom in my own handwriting. What none of us at that table would understand yet, 3 weeks before the party invitations even arrived in everyone's mailbox along Auburn Street, was that the 50th anniversary my parents had been planning as their celebration was about to become the one night this family finally heard its own arithmetic read out loud. The VFW Hall on Auburn Street was strung with white lights and gold 50th anniversary banners when we arrived, the kind of hall that's hosted every wedding, retirement party, and confirmation reception on that side of Rockford for 40 years. The air thick with the smell of a sheet cake and somebody's aunt's 7-layer salad. My father stood near the head table in his good suit, the one he wears maybe twice a year, shaking hands with shop employees who'd shown up out of genuine affection, looking entirely at ease in a room he believed, completely, still belonged to him. My mother waited until the toasts, the way she always does, because my mother has never once given away a moment she could hold on to for an audience. She stood with her wine glass, thanked everyone for 50 years of love and partnership, and then smiling the exact smile she uses for announcements she has already decided are gifts, said that tonight, of all nights, felt like the right one for the family to finally set something right. She looked at Mason. She asked him to stand. I watched my son begin to rise from his chair, jaw tight, already deciding, in real time, how to make this easy on everyone else in the room. I stood up first. Before Mason says anything, I said, I think everyone here should know how long you've been planning this. The room did the particular kind of quiet that has weight to it. The quiet of 200 people working very hard not to look directly at the same person. My mother's smile held for exactly one more second before something behind it shifted. Renee, this isn't the time. You asked Phyllis for my son's savings account balance 3 weeks ago, I said. Not last week. 3 weeks ago, before a single invitation to tonight ever went out. I set Phyllis's written statement on the table in front of my parents, dated, signed. Phyllis, 2 tables back, did not look away. You didn't pick $92,000 because it was fair. You picked it because it was exactly what he had. My father's hand found the back of a chair, like he needed something solid to hold onto a thought. This is family business, he said. It doesn't need an audience. You gave it one, I said. I'm just finishing the conversation you started. I laid the old loan paperwork beside Phyllis's letter. 11 years ago, I gave you $30,000 for the CNC mill. You've never repaid a cent of it. I never asked you to. I sent you $150 a month for 6 winters, so you wouldn't have to choose between heat and payroll. $10,800. I never mentioned that either. I let that sit for a second in the room before I said the rest. I gave you $40,800 over 11 years, quietly, because that's what you do for family. It took you 3 weeks to decide my son owed you $92,000 more. Derek, 2 tables over, had gone very pale, his fork frozen halfway to his plate, looking like a boy discovering for the first time that the rescue being arranged in his name had never actually been about him. My mother's voice, when it came, had lost its brightness entirely. We just wanted things to feel even, she said. Derek struggled. Mason's done so well. We thought, you didn't want to fix Derek's future, I said. You wanted to spend my son's. Nobody in that hall said anything for what felt like a very long time. My mother looked down at the 2 documents on the table in front of her, the loan and the letter. The way you look at something you're hoping will rearrange itself into a different story if you stare at it long enough. My father picked up his water glass, set it back down without drinking from it, and looked toward the kitchen past through window, like there was somewhere else in that building he suddenly needed to be. The hall did not erupt. It simply emptied of something it had been running on for 50 years. Conversations resumed in pieces, quieter than before. The particular careful murmur of people deciding what they'd just watched and whether they were allowed to talk about it yet. My mother sat back down slowly, her hand resting on the edge of the table near the loan papers without touching them, and for the first time in my whole life, I watched her not know what to say next. I found Mason near the coat rack a few minutes later, already holding both our coats, the hardshell case with Atlas Zero, in it tucked under one arm because he'd brought it that night for reasons I still haven't asked him about and may never need to. Are we leaving? He asked. We're leaving, I said. In the car, on Auburn Street, the white lights of the hall shrinking in the rearview mirror, he was quiet for a long stretch before he finally spoke. Did you know you were going to do that? He asked. I knew I wasn't going to let you do it instead, I said. He nodded slowly, looking out the window, and after another long, quiet stretch, he said very softly, I kept thinking there had to be a version where they actually saw what I built. I didn't have a clean answer for that, not that night. What I noticed, glancing over at a red light on Charles Street, was the particular stillness of his hands resting on the case in his lap. Not gripping it, not opening it, just resting. The way hands rest when someone has finally set something down they didn't know they'd been carrying. We stopped covering the shop's winter gas bills the week after the party. $10,800 over 6 years, gone now. Simply absorbed back into our own household instead. I sent my parents one letter, the only one I've sent since, formally forgiving the $30,000 loan in writing, not as a gift, but as a closed account. A sentence that meant exactly what it said. There is nothing left between us to keep track of, because there is nothing left between us to keep giving. I have not done the shop's overflow scheduling during Phyllis's vacations since, a small thing nobody but my mother would notice. And she has noticed because she has called twice to ask, carefully, whether I might reconsider. I haven't called back either time. A few weeks ago, I went down to the basement to ask Mason something about dinner and found him in the unfinished half, not at the soldering station, but at a brand new bench he'd built into the far wall with money he is, for the first time in 2 years, spending entirely on himself. Atlas Zero sat on a shelf above the bench now, in the open, no case, the crooked stabilizer still uncorrected, displayed the way you display something you've decided was never the embarrassing part of the story. "This one's just mine," he said, not looking up. The way he always says it when something matters more than he's willing to say outright. He's training a friend from school now, a freshman who's good with code but clumsy with a soldering iron, the way Mason once was. He doesn't talk about his grandparents much. When he does, it's brief, factual. The way he describes a part that didn't meet tolerance. Not cruel, just accurate. I don't think my parents ever set out to price my son like an asset on someone else's balance sheet. I think somewhere along the way, they simply stopped believing love and arithmetic were two different languages. And once you believe that, every child in the family eventually becomes a number you can move around to balance someone else's account. The question I'm still sitting with, the one I don't think has a clean answer, isn't whether what they did was wrong. It's whether Derek's sitting 2 tables over that night, fork frozen, discovering his own rescue had been arranged without his knowledge, was a victim of that arithmetic too, in a way none of us, including me, have fully reckoned with yet. If you've ever watched the people who raised you put a number on your child before they ever put a question to him, you already know exactly why I couldn't let that toast finish the way they'd planned it. So tell me, do you think Derek deserves any blame for staying quiet at that table, or was he just as priced and just as powerless as Mason was? If this story meant something to you, subscribe, like it, share it with someone who needed to hear it today, and tell me down in the comments what you would have said if you'd been the one standing up that night.